go live. Boom. All right. In theory, you can see me and I can see you. It's like a thing that's happening. So I wanted to do a quick little discussion of export control, which I know is not everyone's favorite thing, but I thought it'd be interesting for some people who've never really touched it, or if you've touched it and you're confused about it, which should be everybody because it's very confusing. So let's go over it real quick. If you have a question, you can pop it into the old chat, the live chat, and I will maybe answer it, maybe not. Who knows? All right. Top 5 things you didn't know about export control. So the first thing I think most people don't know about export control is deemed export. And I put this little happy picture of this person, even though actually it turns out that picture is from a Dutch company doing things. I mean, very complicated things related to integrated circuits. But what is deemed export? Deemed export, first of all, it's pretty unique to the United States in terms of even existing. And what it means is that if you're on an H-1B or otherwise a foreign person in the United States, then I still can't sell you something that's controlled by export control. Sometimes. Remember, everything in this talk is like sometimes. But this is like an extra fun factor that you get with the United States export control laws that adds in some excitement to any policy that you're developing. Because can you imagine running a penetration testing company in the United States and having a bunch of people who are H-1Bs, which is a lot of these companies, and then having to figure out the export controls around your software that you're building or that you're buying, right? So if you look at some of your major financials, they run their network with people on H-1Bs. That's a thing that happens. So you need to figure out how all of this fits together if you're trying to build export control law around it. So it's a fun fact of life. So next steps. I was reading a paper a couple days ago. You may have seen that stream, but I wanted to point out that what they do in the Wassenaar arrangement that's just mind-blowing. It's like, it really is like reading a Scientology document. If you've ever read Scientology documents, they just like redefine terms that are normal terms that mean something in particular to normal humans, but they've redefined them. So the Wassenaar arrangement has redefined the term technology to mean information, specifically information like blueprints, plans, diagrams, or training, or just manuals, just information, just the stuff that like would make it, like anything that would go in a frac paper is technology, essentially. So it is very confusing to people because what they see is a very limited thing that is controlled, but what they don't realize is that control seeds this tree of control on anything required for the development, production, or use of that thing, which could reach down into fuzzing, for example, if you're controlling intrusion software. So that's something that I think people don't quite realize, right? So the export of technology, meaning papers, which are controlled, which are required again is a redefine for the development, production, or use, right? So now I'm in this world where nothing means anything and I have to go like look all this stuff up, right? So this is going to play into what you have to do later to figure out whether or not you're in compliance, for example. But also, if you're reading this as a government person building these sorts of regulations, you are now requiring any technology sector you want to obey with export control to become an expert at this kind of thing. So that is important for both sides. So again, controls do not apply to things in the public domain. That means conference talks, right? Or to basic scientific research. There's a lot of stuff here that is naturally just excluded because it would be insane to try to control that stuff, right? And when we say it would be insane, we mean people are still trying to do it today, and every country thinks about this in a very different way. And what's insane to the Americans and perhaps protected under the First Amendment is completely normal to the Germans. So, and that's a problem for later. We'll discuss that. So, you are special. You are a special snowflake. Let's read the general software note real quick. What I really think, this is like sort of like if you're selling software and it's just like an over-the-counter transaction, like you could buy it at Best Buy, then yeah, there's very little point in export control applying to that software. But this does not release software controlled by information security. Interesting. And here's another thing that I think is very interesting, which is when the big brains first wrote the Wassenaar arrangement, and throughout the history of it, they've really made a big differentiation between source code and binaries, aka object code. But in this world, we know that most of the things that we write are in a scripting language, which is neither of those two things, right? So the scripting languages are neither object code nor source code, realistically. And the reason for there's a lot of stuff implicit in the philosophy of export control about you developing a technology, giving someone that technology, and them being able to modify it. And the problem with that is that they assume the source code is something we keep and the object code is something you can't modify. So already we know people can modify object code. That is a thing that we all do in this world. But when it comes to scripting languages, it really breaks the brain of the whole system. So again, nothing releases software that is information security related. Already you're seeing very special purpose stuff. So I think that's pretty interesting. And I want you to see, this is going to be a quick presentation, but at the end of this presentation, you will understand everything there is to know about export control. So here's an example of just an export control phrase, just a bit, just like a little snippet, right? So you see them saying, hey, there's a technology and we want to talk about something above, 0.13 micrometers, right? So if you're doing anything above 0.13 micrometers, we just don't care. We don't care about you. You're uncontrolled. You're considered old technology. You're old and busted, and we don't want to talk to you. Assuming you also, this is an and statement, incorporate multi-layer structures, you have a silicon thing, with 5 or fewer metal layers, right? So, you're not like a big, thick chip. You're a thin chip that's really old. You're just an old technology. Okay, right? So here's a definition the sort of things you would see. Here's another one I think is really interesting, which is, we want to control electric assemblies that are rated for operation like really cold or really high, or radiation hardened against radiation at the following level, which is the sort of level that you would see, I'm guessing, in outer space, right? So one thing I think is very interesting here is this is like you start seeing these sort of end use stuff creep in, right? Oh, wait a minute. It turns out that airplanes get their computers radiation hardened because they're flying up where there's less atmosphere, right? And they also get their computers cold and heat hardened because maybe it gets hot up there. I don't know. Anyway, so this is something that I think is very, we'll start to see some of this stuff creep in, right? So very interesting. Okay. When does export control work, right? So if you're writing a paper about O-Day or about anything really, and you want to talk about export control, you probably want to know when it works and when it doesn't work. I'm guessing. Maybe you don't care, but you should care. So one thing you should know is historically, end use and end user specifications are pretty unusual, right? So if you have a solid control, it's crafted from functions and item performs, characteristics, and performance levels, right? So what do those things have? They usually have numbers. That's a thing. You want solid control, it has a number. But I will tell you there's a secret. What is it you're trying to actually do with your export control? Are you trying to control technology spread? AKA, do I want to keep night vision from being in the hands of every single militia in the Middle East? Right? That's an example of controlling technology spread. Or do I want to control domestic companies? Right? So you can see a case where, say, Israel wanted to control its domestic companies in a very specific way. It doesn't have to have anything to do with a particular technology of any kind. They may just want the information that a technology company has or some other thing, right? So it has nothing to do with this. It doesn't have to. So then you would have subjective terms in your control. You would have a common technology. You don't really care about foreign availability. If you're trying to control technical spread, you really care about foreign availability because there's no point controlling technology that's available in China, right? There's just no point to that, right? So I want to have technical specifications because I'm specifically saying this technology, right? So I'm not going to care what the end use is of, a laser ray gun. Like, I'm going to want you not to have laser ray guns. That's the difference between a technological control that is being used for tech spread versus controlling domestic companies. Those are two different uses of export control. And I built a little framework so you can decide why a control exists or what it could possibly be good at. Because I think there's a confusion in a lot of people's heads that if they write an export control, it will control the spread of technology, which they don't all do, right? So like, you have to say, is there foreign availability of this thing? So now I have to go do the typey research and be like, did I spell foreign right? I can never spell foreign, but let's pretend I spelled foreign right. So if I do the typey research and I find out that ZTE and Huawei both make a particular kind of network kit and they sell it a lot of different places and they support it and it's perfectly good and there's no way to differentiate that from a piece of Cisco kit, then why on earth would I control the Cisco kit, right? You see what I'm saying? There's no point. If your entire Wassenaar group, the group of people that are in this thing that develop the software, let's say it's only like 3 different countries that develop some particular piece of technology. Let's say night vision, right? So there's 3 countries that develop it. If they don't agree in philosophy on how they're going to implement the rule that they've just come up with, it doesn't matter that they agreed that there should be a rule necessarily. So that's something you need to keep an eye on. Again, what's really good to control is stuff that's really hard to reverse engineer, stuff that needs constant support and updates. So, for example, Android needs constant support and updates and is basically unique because of the network effects. Like, say, monopolies are much easier to control than non-monopolies, right? So some of the silicon lithography tools, especially the ultraviolet ones, even when I have one right in front of me and I have the best reverse engineers on the planet looking at it, they'll never be able to figure out how this thing was created. That's magical. That's how you want to control stuff, right? So that's all good. Another thing that you can find a way to get stuff in is when there's a standard, right? So if I say, there's a worldwide standard for law enforcement, network tapping, right? So if I have to advertise my product, I have to advertise that it complies with that standard. That is much easier to control than when there's no normal standard, right? So if I was like saying, is there a standard for intrusion software? No, there is not, right? So that is definitely the 2 things you can see. So cryptographic software fits into here, right? If it's 2 fish, it's 2 fish, right? So I know that it's 2 fish. I can say, it's 2 fish, and I can control it based on that as a technical differentiator. The other thing that's easier to control is stuff that has an agreed upon metric, right? So that's not as simple as you might think because performance of a computer is a very difficult thing to measure. And it's defined in the Wassenaar arrangement in a really complex way and a way that has degraded over time. So you may think, you just count how fast a chip is. But chips don't get faster necessarily anymore. So now we're running into situations where they're like, let's just count how many, floating point operations it can do. And then it's like, you kind of want to count floating point operations per watt, right? So everything gets more and more complex over time. And sometimes the metric you thought was really good turns out to not be useful at all. If you can't come up with an easy to agree upon metric, you shouldn't be controlling it. That's a pretty simple metric of its own. Again, the reality is export control works pretty well when you have ServiceNow and you can integrate it into your entire pipeline, right? So things that are going to take, like if I order 100 lathes, then the lathe company is like, well, let's put all these companies into our ServiceNow pipeline, and it will execute the export control stuff, and we can have sign-offs and the whole thing, right? You have a business logic to it. It is much harder to do when essentially you have a teeny company and the export control logic is in their head, and they tend to have a lot of turnover, right? So that's a different little thing, right? So small and even mid-sized technology companies really struggle with some of these requirements because, for example, even figuring out like how often do I update my entity list, right? Like that has to come in. There's an FTP site that comes in. So there's a lot of stuff that people struggle with. Okay, extremely rare technology that is specific to one use. That is your sweet spot for export control versus common technology with many uses. And sometimes that happens because a particular technology enters a new use, right? So LiDAR, for example, is no longer a drone technology. It is now primarily a car technology. And that is a really interesting thing. And what you don't see is a real flexibility with most export control regimes, because this is something you may not know. To change the text in the Wassenaar arrangement, you need unanimous agreement with like 41 companies or countries. That's hard to get. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that if you have an amalgamation of many different pieces, none of which are special or really controlled in any way, and you would like to build a control around the amalgamation, you are screwing up. There's no other way to say it. Realistically, this is an insane thing to try to do. If you think about how business works, just the basics of business. If I go in as a Splunk reseller to some random place that is not allowed to buy my product plus another product, and I'm a Splunk salesperson, I'm definitely going to have a reseller in country for whatever that other piece is that then bypasses this export control. See what I'm saying? Like, there's no way that if I'm allowed to sell Splunk and I'm allowed to sell, I don't know, Splunk Analysis Toolkit Bob, that I'm not going to try to sell Splunk and then be like, hey, here's Splunk Analysis Toolkit Bob, reseller in your country. You could plug it in, right? Like, it's just really weird. This is something that you see over and over again where they're like, well, we're not going to control the thing, but we'll control the thing in combination with something else that's also super easy to get, right? It makes no sense to me that this is a philosophy that people do, but they do. Okay, end use and end user exceptions are weird. They should be weird in your head. And the reason for that is for the most common rationale behind export control that people think is to control the spread of technology. And as you can imagine, this is like, I don't have any way to say what a company in China really does with whatever it is I sold them, right? Like, it's hard. Like, they're going to write down on a piece of paper, I'm using it to pen test my local network. And then who knows what they do with it, right? Like once you start seeing end use and end user exceptions, you know you're in a very different space from the control of the spread of technology. So I think that is a very weird thing. So there's no good studies about why it works or when it doesn't work. There should be studies about when export control works, but there aren't. You should ask yourself why that is. Okay. Here's something you didn't know about export control. You can help me out, and you can help your country out by actually getting involved with export control. One of the ways is the Information Systems Technical Advisory Committee. Commerce runs a bunch of technical advisory committees, but just because Commerce is running it doesn't mean it's not state and DOD and everybody else in the room and learning from the expert information that you might have on a particular area that's interesting, be it AI or security, whatever it is, you can get involved. It's just a meeting that they have, and you can call in or Zoom in or whatever it is these days, and you can talk to the people. You have a question, you can call them up. It's not that many people in the office, and it's going to bubble up to the people who have the right answer pretty quickly. I think that's, there's a lot of stuff here that you could actually learn without too much effort. You may find it fun. You may not find it fun. All right. They're very approachable. That's something you didn't know, I guess. And I think in general, government has become more approachable in the last 5 years, essentially, as the internet's really taken over. But the Commerce Department is, designed to be approachable, full of approachable, smart people. On a broad range of technologies. That's why they have expert groups. So I wanted to just look at 5A1J, and especially this section realistically is for people who are proposing broad new export control rules, right? So if you are Majore Shakta, I'm going to mispronounce that name every time, right? Or someone else at Microsoft who's like, look, let's use the export control hammer. Actually, it's weird because Microsoft itself would never suggest this because they know how bad an idea that is. But the thinky thought people that they fund would suggest this. So, IP network communication surveillance systems. Communication surveillance. So the term surveillance, and it just bugs me to no frickin' end when civil society people call something surveillance software. Because it means so many things to them, and it doesn't mean what it realistically should mean. But this is one of those cases where surveillance is a reasonable term for what I would call breach detection or network analysis, right? So this is the perfect example of what happens when all of the fallacies crash together, right? So one, all of the separate things in 5A1J are available by themselves from different vendors, and you can put them together like a Lego and get a 5A1J thing, right? So that's a true thing, right? Vertical integration is what's controlled, not the technology itself. The other thing is a lot of this stuff implies the next thing, right? So if you see analysis at the application layer, then you're also going to see extraction of metadata and indexing of that data and searching of that data. The only thing that's rare in this entire control is mapping of the relational network of an individual or of a group of people. But you do see that in lots of different things. You also see in this end use and end user exceptions, right? So that's a very strange thing. And one of the things that really is just the creme de la creme of terrible, terrible controls is this carrier class IP network statement at the front. Carrier class, and as a technical term and not a marketing term, carrier class means reliability. It does not mean speed. You'll notice there's not a single number in all of this other than layer 7, which, let me tell you, does not indicate anything in particular. So there's no performance metric. There's no technical differentiator of this thing. This is your absolute worst case scenario when it comes to how to design a control that does anything useful. So it's possible the person who designed this control is literally on this stream, but we are seeing this more and more and more and more and more. This is the exact kind of, like when you see stuff added, it looks like this. This is very different from what you saw earlier. So you have to ask, is it going to work? What is my projected level of success? So the last thing, I wanted to keep this down to 30 minutes, so I think I'm good. The last thing you didn't know about export control is that most companies can't afford to do export control. They really can't. By that, I mean two things. One, most companies have very if you were to try to control their industry, it would be extremely complex for them. They would need to hire a lawyer. Those lawyers are roughly $1,000 an hour. So if your intellectual property development, if your innovation in a sector is happening at very large companies, then they might have a team that does the export control for their new mini startups within those companies. But if you're talking about a technology sector where the investment is happening essentially in the basement, the metaphorical basement, although today literally in people's basement, then they're not going to pay, $15,000 to get some maybe it depends advice from a team of lawyers, right? Like, that's really hard. And the other side of this is licensing can be very broad, can be very easy. You can apply for a license that gives you access to an entire country with a particular product, for example. But let's say that you have the worst case scenario and you're applying for licenses for companies in China that want to buy your product. And there's a competitor, let's say out of Turkey, that also is selling a similar product. Now, when that customer comes to you, you have to tell the customer, look, I know that you're just a purchasing agent that vaguely speaks English. Here's a complex government form that I need you to fill out. And then it says what you're going to use it for, whatever, like random electronic device that I'm trying to sell. And then I'm going to take that form and I'm going to submit it to the Commerce Department. And I will let you know in 6 weeks or so if I'm allowed to sell you this particular device. Right? So if Turkey has a different way of doing this, if they literally are like, you know what, we're going to license you for everything forever, right? Then I'm going to lose every time, right? So there's a lot of reasons: competitive, cost internally, building the framework itself, a lot of reasons why you can't afford to do export control. And it does matter. Legitimacy is a big deal. And what you see here is Trump has indicated that he'd be willing to consider removing the ban on Huawei for better terms in a trade agreement. That means that, like, the whole point of the export control was as a negotiating tactic, right? So the legitimacy of export control itself takes a big hit when this kind of thing comes through. And it is important. So this is my conclusion, which is that it's just a common phrase. And I want everyone who's using export control in the policy world to keep this phrase in mind for historically what has happened, which is export control has worked when you no longer produce that technology in your country. That is how you know the export control has truly worked. And I think that is something that you will see perhaps today in Germany in our field, right? So this is not like this is really funny, it's not a big deal, it doesn't affect our strategic, the return on investment needs to be calculated with this in mind. And if your return on investment is not high, because it is not free to do export control for the government either. It is a lot of work. And so I just want to make sure that as we go through and suggest export control as a solution, even as a solution to get data on a particular field, we need to know what we're getting into. So anyway, that is my talk. 5 things you didn't know about export control that you maybe didn't want to know. And if there's any questions, you can ask them in the chat. If there's no questions, I'll just end the stream. You can go about your day. It'll be awesome. So that's that. This video will be available if anyone wants it. And I'm always happy to go over 5A1J in more detail. I think it's a really bizarre thing that has happened. Even if the goals are good, I still think it's really weird. Like what you have is like, you'll have the whole term civil society just drives me up a wall. But you'll have people come through and they'll be like, why don't you hate NSO Group? Why don't you hate Hacking Team? And I'll be like, even if you do, this may not be the hammer you want. This may be the hammer that just makes them stronger. So that is the end. So I will talk to you guys later. Thank you for watching.